Now, let us commence the session on April 3rd, World Cold War and Peace. Now, let us pay a silent tribute to the victims of April 3rd incident. And for those victims of the April 3rd incident and other victims of politicide.
바로 다음은 여러 바쁜 일정에도 불구하고
Now please be seated.
다음은 여러 바쁜 일정에도
Now let me introduce a distinguished guests who are with us today out of busy schedules. We have Mr. Oh Im-jong, the representative of April 3rd bereaved families. And also we have Mr. Hong Sung-soo, Vice Chair of Jeju April 3rd Working Committee. And we have Mr. Kang Chul-nam, Chair of Jeju April 3rd Special Committee. Let me introduce Mr. Yang Jo-hoon, Chairman of Jeju April 3rd Peace Foundation. And also we have Mr. Yuk Sung-chul from the Blue House. Thank you, everyone. And we also have Mr. Kang Min-chul and Ho Young-sun from Jeju Special Self-Governing Province. They will greet to you. In the interest of time, I was not able to introduce all the guests. Now let us invite Lee Gyu-bae for his opening remarks.
Nice to meet you. Good afternoon, everyone. Every year we have a ceremony at the Jejuporam, and we just have 80 minutes, so there's no introduction of the distinguished guests, and we originally do not have any opening remarks because we are really busy. However, the program has been a little bit changed, so I have an opportunity to have a greeting message to you. So the 16th Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity 2021, and the event to commemorate the April 3rd incident is held now, and I would like to thank all of you for attending today's event. And via the video message, via the video broadcasting, there are a lot of watchers now, and thank you for your attending today's virtual session too. And everybody talks about the vestige of the past, which is the Cold War. It has been a long time since the Cold War was put on end too. However, these days people are now talking about the Cold War again. Yesterday, I saw a news article on the newspaper about the collision between NATO and Russia. And back in 1970s, there has been a problem on the Korean Peninsula between the United States and Russia, Soviet Union, and they are arguing again. So this is the time to think about the Cold War again, and I would like to know more about the reason that a lot of people were victimized at the massacre that took place on May 3rd in Jeju Island. Everybody is still sad because there are still the remaining bereaved families of the victims of the April 3rd incident. So we are trying to analyze the essential characteristics of the April 3rd incident, and to know about the reason, we are organizing today's event. So when the root cause and epicenter of the incident is found and understood, we will be clarified on the significance of the April 3rd incident. So thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule. Mr. Jung Geun-sik, thank you for attending to this event, and Ms. Han Ji-hee, Professor Ju Jin-ho, and Professor Park Tae-gyun, who will make a presentation today. So, the author of a book on the Cold War era, who is also a reporter of Hangyeol newspaper. And there is another guest who is watching us from a long distance at the National University of Singapore, Mr. Matsuda Hajimu. Nice to meet you. So, a lot of people made their efforts for the success of today's event. So hopefully today's event will serve as an opportunity to broaden the landscape on understanding the meaning of April 3rd incident. So hope you enjoy the presentation sessions. Thank you.
Let me introduce our moderator, Mr. Ju Jin-ho from Sangmyeong University. Let me hand it over to our moderator. We were supposed to invite our keynote speaker, Professor Jung Geun-sik. However, I'm afraid he had personal matters to take care of first. So we wanted to rearrange the schedule. That's why. And also, as you understand, keynote speech is very important. So we are going to push it back to the last, as the last session, last speech of the session.
네, 오늘 그 발표해
Now, let me introduce Professor Park Tae-gyun, one of our speakers today. He is the head of Seoul National University's Graduate School of Korean History, and at the moment he is a renowned historian in the field of Korean history. So today, Professor Park Tae-gyun will share his ideas based on this presentation material. And the title of his presentation is "The Massacre Happened in East Asia in 1980s and Jeju." Please welcome Professor Park Tae-gyun.
Thank you for your nice introduction. I am Park Tae-gyun, who will deliver the presentation for today. So I'm really honored to have an opportunity to make a presentation on this meaningful occasion. And hopefully, people will discover the truth behind the April 3rd massacre in Jeju. And I've been reviewing the text for today's session, and I found that other presenters and discussion panels will deliver very meaningful messages. So even after my presentation, there will be a lot of insights that can be gained from the session. And the organizer said, I believe that the organizers are doing really good and by shedding a light upon the April 3rd incident in Jeju, we must approach in terms of universality. And later, I will also touch on the emotional part. As I felt recently that there has been similar accidents like Daegu incident back in 1947, And back in 1948, there was a Yeosu incident. So, given the series of the incidents like that, we have not to minimize the incidents as a local incident, and we don't need to minimize the significance of these incidents. In order to overcome the situation, we have to connect these incidents, and on the other hand, we have to create the universal features in terms of world history regarding the incidents that happened during the Cold War era. And today, a lot of international experts are attending, so we have to raise public awareness on this type of tragic incidents. In this regard, in the conclusion part, let me highlight it again. And here I mentioned about the massacres in the Southeast Asia, and we believe that we have to approach those incidents in the same manner with the Jeju incident. I believe that the framework of the Cold War is quite abnormal because as we are living in the capitalism era, people are easy to be regarded as a very money pursuing ones. However, when we talk about the capitalism era, it means that the world is mobilized by money. And however, the communist countries are led by China, but China has a large market. So the Chinese market has been isolated for quite a long time. So in this era of capitalism, the Cold War wasn't restored in the normal way. And on the process, the ideology served as a role of the religion, actually. So based on ideology, everything was made into decision, and people judge it one's value based on ideology. Because of this, a lot of tragic incidents happened. And actually, these type of incidents happened in peripheral areas. And there were big wars in the Cold War era, which are the Korean War and the Vietnamese War. So in Korea, in the Cold War era, the two different ideologies collided with. And actually, at that time, Korea was regarded as a peripheral country because the center of the Cold War was actually Europe at that time, and Berlin symbolizes the Cold War at that time. However, the biggest victims of the Cold War era were the peripheral regions. And April 3rd incident is one of the examples. And I will take another examples of those type of tragic incidents. And there will be a lot of fruitful examples, fruitful case studies that will be presented by other participants today. And there has been a number of tragic incidents that took place in Turkey and other places. So when we think about the April 3rd incident, we have to think about what kind of efforts were made by the government and how we try to overcome this tragic issue. And people easily think that the massacre we are almost recovered from the massacre, but at the commemoration ceremony, President Moon Jae-in said, we have a long way to go in terms of being restored from the incident. And I believe that by taking a look at the overseas cases, we can find a solution. So we need to change the perception that the incident is almost solved. And when we think about the April 3rd incident, I actually had an interview with the local broadcasting station in Jeju, and at that time I highlighted that the incident is still winked at. And a series of other incidents took place after April 3rd. back in 1940s, when the government of the Republic of Korea wasn't yet to be established, and the injury and hurt of the incident maintained and remained even after the founding of the Korean government. So it began when the U.S. Army was temporarily operated and controlled Korea, and it lasted after the founding of the government of Korea. And the approach of the police and the army were different. In terms of international law, this is not just an issue of Jeju Island, because this is related to the region that were recovered after the Korean War. Back in 1947, the Korean government was established and that gets approval from the United Nations. And at that time, the Korean government was declared as a sole government that was established based on the election. And the approval mentioned that the jurisdiction of the government is the regions that the citizens have a vote for elect. However, at that time, Jeju Island did not have any. Jeju Island wasn't a jurisdiction of the government. So whether the Korean government at that time had the jurisdiction over the Jeju Island is another issue that we must think about. Everybody says that relevant documents are almost discovered. However, we believe that there still is a room for further study regarding the incident. And in this context, let's take a look at the other incidents. I studied about the Vietnamese War, and researchers say, there are some damages caused by the Korean army, and the independent army were suppressed in Manchuria under the Japanese colonial domination. So this triggered a lot of resistance of the Korean people, but the same thing happened repeated in Vietnam by the Korean army. I don't want to say that's true, but referring to the documents made by the US, when dispatching the Korean army to Vietnam, it was preferred because the labor cost for the Korean army was cheaper than the US army. And the other thing was that by 1953, the Korean army had to go to the battlefield. So it hadn't been a long time since the Korean army participated in a war. So they thought it would be really good to utilize the experienced the Korean army in the battlefield in Vietnam. So that was the main considerations of the US government. And there were some wrong points because although Koreans look Asian, Vietnamese people did not regard Koreans as friendly. That's actually the same, I think, with the sentiment that we have against the Japanese people, because we went through the colonial era from the Japanese people. We don't regard the Japanese as friendly, and Indochina countries had to go through the era of French colonialization, but they have something like nostalgia toward that era, so the sentiments are different. So there are some countries that are so negative about their former rulers, colonial rulers. However, there are other countries that are quite familiar with their colonial rulers. And I once visited a museum in Vietnam, and what was really interesting was that the visitors, most visitors are Japanese, not Korean, because Japanese visitors want to find any proof that the Korean army had massacre against the Vietnamese people, because they would be very happy about finding some guilty factors about the Korean people. But the head of the museum in Vietnam said, "We will never give the Japanese the data on the massacre of the Korean army against the Vietnamese people." And what was really interesting is that the method of massacre is quite different between the US Army and the Korean Army. Most of the massacre was made as a retaliation, but the regions that the Korean armies were dispatched was the places that the US Army wasn't really good. So as a replacement, the Korean Army was dispatched. So at the initial stage, Korean armies were really familiarized with the local citizens, and then they one day mobilize all the people together in one place, and then they conduct massacre against the citizens. I heard that during only 1 month, more than 1,400 people were killed by the Korean army, and there was a public grave that all the victims were in. So General Choi Jong-shin said, no matter any damages are made to the Korean army, we should never ever kill a Vietnamese. But although he made the order like this, still the Vietnamese people of the region have the trauma against the Korean army. And there is a statue that symbolizes the hatred toward the Korean army in the village. I saw the two of the statues, so the shock, trauma, and the hatred that the Vietnamese people had regarding the Korean army was demonstrated by those type of statues. So the massacre to the Vietnamese civilians took place especially in the southern part of Vietnam. And the characteristics of the Vietnamese War is that in the Korean War, the UN army went to the north from the south. But who conducted the massacre is not still clear. And in Vietnam, most of the massacre happened in the southern part of Vietnam. And most of the incidents were done by the US Army, but some are done by the Korean Army. So in the massacre in the Vietnamese War symbolizes the massacre based on ideology back in 2060s and 70s. And I also took a look at the Indonesian cases. Discussion panels will also touch on the Indonesian massacre issue again. But let me briefly tell you that the reason and the culprit of the Indonesian massacre is still not clear. And there is a special characteristics of the massacre compared to the April 3rd incident and the Vietnamese massacre, because there is the issue of Chinese Indonesian in this massacre case. First, the US Army intervened into the massacre because at that time, non-alliance countries in the Third World were formed. At that time, the leader of China, Zhou Enlai, said in his speech that it would not be difficult to make a communism in Indonesia, because there are a lot of Chinese Indonesians in the Indonesian society. And from 1965 to 1966, a huge massacre took place in Indonesia. They don't use the term massacre, and they use the term mass killing because the number of the victims was large. And the characteristic of this is that it's related to Chinese Indonesians. And what if there was no intervention from the US Army? People think about it, and they say that without the intervention, even Indonesia would have been a communist country. So, in a nutshell, the US Army saved Indonesia from the communist world. However, we cannot ignore the intervention of the US Army, and there has been a series of documents recently revealed and disclosed. And regarding the list of the victims of the mass killing, people say that the CIA of the United States intervened. However, comparing to April 3rd of Jeju, actually, we don't have enough information about the mass killing in Indonesia because changes of the authority wasn't made in Indonesian society. And Indonesia is a Muslim country, so it's the largest in a Muslim country in terms of population. However, there are a lot of minority tribes in Indonesia, so it's really hard to form a collective power in the civic society. And Indonesia itself is, it has a lot of internal problems, such as the Eastern Timor situation and other regions that wants to declare independence from the Indonesian government. Due to this internal problems, it's really hard to make a progress in the Indonesian society. However, luckily these days, some studies are conducted regarding the Indonesian mass killing, and today's guest, professor from Japan, is also conducting research on the Indonesian case. So when it gains momentum, it would be easier to find the main culprit and reason of the massacre. And on page 16, I mentioned about the mechanics of massacre, which is written by Jess Melvin, and the season of massacre, written by Geoffrey B. Robinson, and act of killing and the view of silence, documentary films were opened to the public, and they received good reputation from the viewers. So, in the process of finding the main culprit of the mass killing, the power of culture was quite huge. And the other thing is that we can learn from the Indonesian situation that the democracy and democratization really matter. To find the main culprit of the massacre and make a reconciliation with the past. So the system and mechanism of democracy could be the leverage of finding the main culprit and reason. And in conclusion, in wartime, there has been victims, and there has been a lot of gaps in the interpretation on the victims of massacre during the wartime. And this consists a huge core of the political situation in countries. And today we are with the committee head of the truth committee for the April 3rd massacre, and we have to reach consensus as a whole society on the incident. And I also had an opportunity to make a presentation on Yosun incident, and people wanted to call it Yosun uprising. And I think that's quite a common opinion regarding the incident, because in order to gain public consensus, we have to make it value neutral so that we can reach consensus. However, basically, it's a political, ideological issue, and Korea is already a democracy. However, the issues are still lingering around us. So, given the phenomena of Marxism or communists back in 1990s, we can realize that although the global Cold War era is put to an end, the remains of the Cold War era is still powerful in the Korean society. So I believe that it won't be easy to find a solution. And there are some cases that the victims were actually the violators of the same incident. And there are some violators who are connected to the death of the civilians. And I took the example of Vietnamese massacre, and the Korean army dispatched to Vietnam was actually, they are violators. However, they were mobilized by the Korean government to be dispatched to Vietnam, and they weren't rewarded about their sacrifice in foreign country war field. So these are the important parts regarding the victims and the violators. So we have to identify the truth, and we have to open the dialogue for reconciliation. Through the consensus in society, I believe that the government and the media played pivotal roles, and during the more than 30 years of control, the cultural power played an important part to identify the truth and the culprit of the situation. And I think there are a few prerequisites. First, the April 3rd has both characteristics of uprising and massacre at the same time. They cannot be separated by 100%, but we firstly focus on massacre, and the controversial parts regarding uprising must be studied further. And the studies must obtain the universal views from global perspective, because this is a uprising that was triggered in the Korean society, and some people raised their voices that those who designed the uprising were actually Communist Party members. So in order to obtain this is the reason that the viewpoints on the incident must obtain the universal perspective globally. And we have to also consider the characteristics of a war and the other uniqueness of the uprising. So we have to think about both universal features and unique features of the incident. So I believe not only the researchers and those who are interested in the uprising must also study the Daegu incident, Yosun incident, and other mass killing during the Korean War. These are just a series of the same type of incidents. And there are some historical events that have the characteristics of uprising and massacre at the same time. And regarding these type of accidents, we must interpret it from the cultural perspective. And what I got a shock was that about a few days ago, I was watching the TV history program that I featured in, and I met Daniel. This Daniel boy is from Germany, and he made a documentation on the April 3rd Jeju uprising, and this type of activities can have a huge cultural power. So movies, books, and documentations can have power to make people raise their awareness on the uprising. And this Daniel was well aware of the similar incidents happened in Europe, such as the uprising in the Eastern Europe. And for him, Jeju uprising and massacre wasn't really shocking because in history, he had the similar accidents like this. This is the reason that the public diplomacy is important. So the issue of April 3rd incident and other incidents, we have to take a look at the various events happened during the Korean War and the Cold War era. This will broaden the base for understanding in the Korean society. And what's really deplorable is that more and more people lose their interest for history, and people say it's really hard just to being a breadwinner, but we must not forget about the past. So this should be the focus of the projects and campaigns. This is all about my presentation. Thank you.
네, 박태윤 교수님.
Thank you for your insightful presentation, Professor Park. So let me rearrange the order of today's session. So I mentioned that the first keynote speaker wasn't here today. So next, let me invite. Now it's the time for us to have the keynote speech from committee head Mr. Jung Geun-sik, and then we will have a panel discussion.
자, 준비하는 동안 제가 정구식 위원장님을 잠깐 소개를 하겠습니다.
Let me introduce Mr. Jung Geun-sik. He is the head of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he received his degrees in sociology in Seoul National University, and also he is a member of the board directors for Jeju April 3rd Peace Foundation. Please welcome Mr. Jung Geun-sik for his keynote speech. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I apologize for the inconvenience that I caused. I almost forgot about what time it was because the discussion I had with other participants today was quite interesting. And the organizer wanted me to talk about the Cold War as well as peace. First of all, I am very delighted to meet you all in this 16th Jeju Forum. As you all know, the forum was organized thanks to the effort of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Central Government of Korea, as well as the civil society of the province. I'm afraid it's too late. However, I deliver my congratulations on the special act on the Jeju April 3rd incident. And the revision act, I believe, includes the complete reconciliation of the incident. But this term complete doesn't make sense sometimes regarding history. We need to be very cautious when we use this term conflict. But I'm pretty confident that the reconciliation and other project will be settled peacefully and contribute to the peace building going forward. In the case of Jeju April 3rd incident, it is quite a unique massacre case. And it is not easy to make bipartisan agreement. However, when it comes to special act on the Jeju April 3rd incident, there was no other opinion on the passage of the bill. So today, under the theme of Cold War and peace, I'd like to share my ideas and thoughts and make an update on the current status of the reconciliation project. In my opinion, in the Korean history, the Jeju April 3rd incident has very meaningful and significance. So the Jeju April 3rd incident is a meaningful incident that happened in the middle of history of Cold War. But with this incident, we were able to break the 50-year-long silence of the world. And before the Special Act on Jeju April 3rd incident, we had many other stepping stones like May 18 democratization movement and others. But however, without this incident, without this Jeju April 3rd incident, these other acts would have not been passed in the National Assembly. And there was a series of incidents in the history of Korea. As a historian, I tend to distinguish events and the consequences. But I was not sure until recently that this April 3rd incident should be distinguished as event or circumstances. However, I think now April 3rd incident is more like a consequence that can be defined in a certain period of time. So 20 years ago, we made some achievement. And 20 years later, we are repeat history itself. In that part, I feel regrettable. As you understand, April 3rd incident has two meanings. First of all, it was a massacre. So the period since the incident, it was an incident based on sacrifices of victims. So I believe with the passage of the Special Act, it will highlight the rehabilitation of victims of the incident. So on the one hand, it has a local meaning, but at the same time, it has the overall history related meaning for not only Korea, but also the Northeast Asia as a whole. And similar incidents happened in Taiwan in 1947, and similar incident happened in 1948. It is interesting that two similar events happened back then. we started to call the victims of the incident sacrificed for the democracy of the society. So the 7 years from 1947 to 1954 was historically meaningful because there was a civil war in China as well. But I doubt that the people in Jeju didn't know about that. They must have known about such incident in other nations. But I'm not sure to what extent the citizens in Jeju understood the situation in China at that time. So there's this common time frame for these two incidents. Another thing is that after the April 3rd incident, the division of Korean Peninsula and the division or isolation of Northeast Asia started to become official. So throughout the time of silence, there were some people who raised their voice in Jeju Island. Recently, I studied on the bordering area in Korea, in Taiwan to be specific, and I thought what would be the history of these neighboring incidents happened in Asian region at that time. The collection of these incidents must have led to the strategy for Vietnam War. And also there was a strategy village in Malaysia. Malaysia had similar situation as Indonesia at that time. So I imagine what kind of phenomenon this strategy village would have brought to the nation. So all these incidents were closely related to each other back in 1950s and 1960s. Since 1998, we have tried to link the Jeju April 3rd incident to similar issues in Taiwan and Japan. So the institution, my institute, studied on the incident that happened in the region back then. And I encouraged the institute to study more on this specific time frame, which is 48 years. I think this kind of study could be a breakthrough for dealing with the pending issues of the Korean history. As you know, Cold War has something to do with Jeju Island. I'd like to start this story with 1988 Seoul Olympics. Before Seoul Olympics, the other fours did not participate in the Olympic Games that were held by the other half. And the Seoul Olympics, however, so many countries participated, and this affected North Korea as well. So in the following Olympic Games and other international sports games, North Korea started to dispatch their team as well. After 1990, Korea-Soviet Union diplomatic ties they had a summit in Jeju Island. So Jeju Island has become a symbol of peace and prosperity. In line with that, I believe Jejuforum was invented. And also, President Gorbachev visited Jeju back in 1991. These two big events were great leverage for Jeju Island to become the symbol of peace for the peninsula and the region. But I'm afraid the vision of April 3rd Institute is disproportionately focused on civil movement. But going forward, I'd like to urge you to put more focus on history as well. I'm afraid I'm giving you too much homework to do. And in 1998, there was the second East Asia Conference on Peace and Human Rights. I cannot forget how impressive it was at the time. So this conference was also an important historical event. But afterwards, as you know, in 2005, Jeju Island was designated as a special self-governing province and also the Peace Island. So overall, I believe the history is 15 years old. I am proud that I'm a part of this movement and this evolvement. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the Special Act on April 3rd incident as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Basic Act. So after 5 years of efforts, we were finally able to have this Truth and Reconciliation Act. I believe it was the power of the community that accelerated the passage of the Basic Act ahead of April 3rd Incident Special Act. And the second round of Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a little bit different agenda. They started to focus on other humanitarian issues. There are other human rights violation cases where we need to put more focus. As mentioned before, we're going to revise the Special Act on the Jeju April 3rd incident, and I believe this will impact on other pending bills as well. So, up until now, up to 8,000 people shared their stories with the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in the beginning, people were doubtful about the effectiveness and validity of this commission. However, as time goes by, people feel increasingly confident in the power of this commission. So there have been many human rights violation cases that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have been interested in. And also the commission is paying attention to the incident that had happened right after May 18 democracy movement. One of the biggest issue at the moment is that the sacrifice by the Korean authority can be easily identified. However, if the issue goes beyond the border of Korean authority, it's not easy to deal with by the commission can address only the issues that are within the boundary of Korean authority. But there could be other issues such as the kidnapped people to North Korea, etc. So there's this ambiguity of translation of the range of the law and responsibility of the commission. And also in the second round of the commission, we put an emphasis more on the reconciliation, not trust. But that doesn't mean that we are not interested in truth anymore. Just we need to put an emphasis on reconciliation to make sure that truth is identified. So it's relatively easy to make compensation for the victims sacrificed by the government authority. However, between two different countries like the US and Korea and Japan and Korea, or inter-Korean issues, are not easy to be addressed within the boundary of the commission. As you know, from the perspective of reconciliation and peace, by and large, in the past, when the Soviet Union and US Cold War was addressed, it was replaced by the US-China conflict. So now the reconciliation issue gets all the more complicated. However, we need to maintain our efforts to make peace in the region. So Jeju province has made lots of effort in order to establish peace. But we need to question ourselves if our effort has transformed into tangible power to establish peace in the region. So after the special act on the Jeju April 3rd incident, the power of community needs to be maintained. And also we need to make sure that the power of peacemaking in Jeju Island is transformed into the tangible power that changes our lives. So this challenge should be addressed not only by the government or the Jeju province, but also by the citizens.
네, 정근식 위원장님 감사드립니다. 사실 정근식 위원장님을 모셔서 이렇게 짧게 말씀을 끝내게.
So I am sorry to ask you to summarize your speech. We had quite limited time, so we didn't have any other option. So we have two panelists. First, we have Masuda Hajimu from National University of Singapore. He is actually from Osaka, Japan. He also studied history and obtained his PhD in Cornell University. So we are going to listen to him based on a pre-recorded video.
I'm a historian at the National University of Singapore. So I've been working on 20th century Asian history as well as the histories of the Korean War and the Cold War. And more recently, I've been working on reconsideration and reconceptualization of the Cold War world and its history by focusing on what I call social warfare, like social wars, that is, ordinary people's everyday struggles on the ground. So here, let me begin with Professor Park Tae-kyun's presentation, which I liked quite a lot. So what I like most is his approach to re-examining the Jeju 4.3 incident. So he approaches the incident by placing it in the framework of world history and juxtaposing it with massacres in Vietnam and Indonesia, instead of viewing it simply as an event in Korean history. In the beginning of his presentation, he pointed out that the nature of the Jeju incident, as well as its scale, has not been fully clarified, even after a series of investigations in the past 2 decades. And then, in order to deepen our thinking, he introduces massacres in Vietnam and Indonesia, namely those conducted by the US and Korean forces in the Vietnam War, as well as the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. And in both cases, he highlights the roles played by the state in mobilizing people and setting the stage for these massacres, as well as carrying out and concealing them afterwards. Thus, in conclusion, he argues for the need to acknowledge the responsibility of state, demanding truth and compensation. And at the end, a little bit hastily, a little bit abruptly, he also referred to the need for further academic research on another important aspect, that is, social struggles and historical conflicts concerning the Jeju incident. So as a discussant, I'd like to develop his argument in 2 ways. One, by broadening the scope of comparison, and the other by considering the last point, aspect of social conflict, even more seriously. So let me go through these one by one. First, while Professor Park compared the Jeju incident with massacres in Vietnam and Indonesia, I would suggest broadening the scope of comparison even further and incorporating cases of social suppressions in the world, such as McCarthyism in the US, the Red Purge in Japan, the White Terror in Taiwan, as well as the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines, in addition to the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. Some people might be surprised that I call these events social suppressions because they've usually been considered typical cases of political suppression. And more specifically, anti-communist suppression at the height of the Cold War. In our conventional view, they were nothing but Cold War suppression. And yet, if we examine each case more closely, with particular attention to the aspect of social struggles and historical conflict, they look quite different, I think. For instance, McCarthyism has usually been considered a case of anti-communist politics, anti-communist suppression. But if we look at the victims more carefully, we notice that they were not necessarily communists or communist sympathizers. Rather, those victims tended to be, for instance, African Americans, civil rights activists, labor activists, feminist activists, gays and lesbians, and advocates of the New Deal programs such as public housing and universal health care programs. So what these diverse group of people represented was not communist ideology at all, but elements of social change that emerged from experiences of Great Suppression and World War II. In other words, if we take a social viewpoint, we can see McCarthyism as a nativist backlash, a sort of social conservative phenomena that operated to contain and silence disagreements in the chaotic post-World War II period. So here I don't have enough time to discuss other cases in Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines and other parts of the world. But in my book, that published in English and Japanese, I've examined each case and described them as part of global phenomena of social warfare, in which ordinary people, who today would be called grassroots conservatives, silenced various disagreements and elements of social change in order to maintain order and harmony in society. The case of Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966 was not included in my books. But in my new project, Reconceptualizing the Cold War on the Ground Experiences in Asia, in this project, I have been working with several Indonesian scholars to re-examine the Indonesian massacre from a social viewpoint. In this case, too, the state, particularly the army, undoubtedly played important roles, but our research at the same time shed light on various social and local conflicts, including not only political and economic disputes, but gender, religious, ethnic, and personal struggles within villages and communities. In short, by broadening the scope of comparison, we can see that the Jeju incident might have more commonality than differences with other social suppressions. And this awareness, I think, will force us to rethink more seriously about Professor Park's last point, that is, the need to look into the aspect of social struggles and historical conflicts concerning the Jeju incident. So with this point in mind, I'm eager to know what were actually being fought over among people in the name of the Cold War. I would inquire the following question. For instance, did post-war Korea's various conflicts really come from ideological differences? Were mass killings conducted only between the state and islanders? Weren't there any social, cultural, or local conflict on the island? In other words, what kind of social, cultural, local, gender, or even generational conflict existed underneath the Cold War confrontation? Even ideology mattered. What kind of individual emotions were carried through in the form of ideology, whether communism or anti-communism? What kind of people were more interested in leftist thought, and what kind of reactions arose before the incident? So in short, I'm curious about what was going on the ground and among people before, during, and after the uprising and suppression. So I'm saying this because, like many other societies at the time, Korea went through drastic social changes in the post-World War II era. This was particularly the case for Jeju Island because following the end of Japanese colonialism, tens of thousands of Jeju Islanders were returning from Japan. As a matter of fact, many Jeju Islanders went to Japan during the colonial period. And in Osaka, which is my hometown, by the way, Jeju Islanders made up the majority of the Korean population. Then, considering the history of Korean labor's movement in Osaka and considering Korean women's active participation in it, it's not surprising that they might have brought back kind of a new customs and new cultures, a new mode of social activism, and new notions of gender relationships to the island. And it's not surprising that all of these became seeds of social change, as well as those of social tensions on the island, at a degree more intense than the rest of the Korean peninsula. So in this way, by broadening the scope of comparison and by focusing on the aspect of social conflict, I think we can not only place the Jeju incident within a broader framework of 20th century global history, but also we can develop alternative views concerning the nature of the incident. And in fact, I'm very much interested in exploring this topic further. And I would be very happy if I have a chance to work with any scholars and researchers on Jeju Island or in South Korea in the future. So thank you very much for listening.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you for your insightful speech. Because of the constrained time, I'm really sorry for reporter Ha Ho-jun, but we must be punctual. That's the request from the organizer. So please go briefly over the remarks from Professor Park, as short as possible. Good afternoon. I am Ha Ho-jun from Hangare newspaper. Actually, I prepared for 10 minutes speech. However, it must be done in 3 to 4 minutes, but I will get accelerated to get punctual. So please refer to my data on the method for establishing solidarity to solve the issues of April 3rd incident. So I was deeply impressed that Mr. Park Tae-gyun said that we must try an approach from the global perspective. And due to the ideology and colonial rules, the Cold War era was brought about, and it was triggered by the internal war, civil war in Greece. And we conducted a comparative research between Greece civil war and Jeju April 3rd incident. With the internal war in Greece, the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union was in a full swing, and the civil war in Greece showed that the system of the Cold War was beginning to be established. And at that time, Jeju Island could not be free from the influence of the Cold War. This year marks the 71st year of the Korean War. And actually, the general from the US was quite interconnected with the Jeju Island, and he also served for Greece. At that time, he participated in the civil war in Greece, and the military advisor, also served for Jeju Island to suppress the April 3rd incident in Jeju. And after that, he participated in the Vietnamese War. This history timeline of the general also has the indicator and lessons. The April 3rd incident of Jeju was coincided with the Indonesian mass killing incident, which was triggered by the government at that time. And actually, no one left after the mass killing because of the people who seemed to be identifying themselves with the Communist Party was killed. So there are some common issues between the two massacres, because the massacres took place during the Cold War era, and there are a lot of victims and the bereaved families who are still suffering from trauma from the incident. That's the case with Jeju, Greece, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So people are still suffering. In this regard, under the circumstances of the Cold War in East Asia, the victims and those who experienced the situation must raise their voice so that the international consensus was formed. The topic of today's discussion is April 3rd. And during the Cold War era, the April 3rd incident took place, and we cannot talk about this issue without talking about the US, because at that time, the US action was quite suppressive and violent at that time. And the response from the United States showed that they were really afraid of the impacts that could be triggered by the Cold War, and they thought they must prevent Jeju Island from being a communist region. So, Professor Park Tae-gyun, I would like to ask you a question. So, the researchers of the incident says that the U.S. is responsible for the massacre. So, what's the method to make the U.S. people to recognize their fault in the April 3rd incident? Thank you for your speedy speech. And Mr. Park, Professor Park, would you give the answer to Mr. Ha? Would you give the answer to the last question of reporter Ha? You are such a renowned scholar who have a lot of information and knowledge about the US. So please. Actually, there's no fixed methodology. We must just discover and excavate the truth. There are U.S. armies or U.S. authorities who were in Korea, and there are a lot of relevant documents and data that they personally submitted to libraries. Regarding Hausmann, the data from Hausmann are distributed to a few libraries in the United States, and I must collect data from those libraries. But last but not least, I would like to highlight the importance of the public diplomacy utilizing cultural asset. When we talk about the Vietnamese War, we have to acknowledge our fault and guilt that we conducted in the Vietnamese War field. So when you talk about Korea and the brand image of Korea as a nation, it's not really about economic upgrade and flourishing culture. However, the other method would be we have to reconcile with the wrongdoings of the past. Then we can establish our brand image of a just country. So when we return to the past, it's not a regrettable, shameful thing. Rather, it's a demonstration of our justice. So when the public has the consensus upon my opinion, the Korean qualification or brand image will be upgraded by a notch. Thank you. Due to the limits in time, as a moderator, I prepared my own comment, but I don't think I have enough time to talk about it. But the issues regarding the Korean Army's wrongdoing during the Vietnamese War, the special award for the Jeju hours was given to the victims of the Vietnamese War. So if the country cannot take the initiative at the private level, we must take the initiative. And Jeju was the first to kick off those efforts and actions. So in order to commemorate the April 3rd incident, and in order to deepen our understanding on the April 3rd incident, we have to study more, think more, and consider more agendas that were raised on this venue. And Professor Masuda said, it is not only a political issue, but also a societal issue, and it's about conflict and controversy. So he mentioned that let's change the angle that sees the incident. So when the revision of the special act on the April 3rd incident was made, we have to take the different approach compared to the past. We cannot make a perfection. Rather, we should try perfection. So, as a head of the History Museum of Korea, I've been taking a look at a lot of tragic incidents happened in the process of going democracy. I thought Jeju incident must be regarded in a new, refreshed way because it's really an important, crucial issue. And I believe that Jeju is doing really well. So please maintain your attitude, Jeju, and then we will finally solve the issue. So that's all about me, and thank you for your listening. Thank you. I'm sorry that I tried really hard to be punctual. Thank you.